Totteridge and Whetstone is a station on the High Barnet branch of the Northern Line of the London Underground. But its history goes back a long, long way, to before the Underground even existed as a concept. Back in the 1860s, this hilly area of North London had a problem. The locals wanted a railway, but none of the railway companies wanted to give them one. They were more interested in getting to the big cities in the Midlands and the North, and the best way to do that was to avoid the hills as much as possible. So the people of these northern heights decided that they would have to build their own railway. A new company was formed, the Edgware, Highgate and London Railway. The idea was that they would build the line which would connect with the Great Northern Railway somewhere in the Holloway area. The Great Northern, which had been one of the companies that had shunned the area originally, was more agreeable towards this plan. It was much lower risk for them. All they had to do was run the trains. One of the destinations the new company intended to serve was Barnet. Also known as Chipping Barnet, this was a market town and therefore an important destination. Ironically, this was one of the few places that the Great Northern Railway actually did want to serve, and initially they fought the Edgware, Highgate and London's plan in favour of their own branch. But the EHLR was in trouble. They were learning the hard way why other companies didn't want to build railways through the hills. The difficult terrain added time and costs onto the endeavour. So although Parliament found in favour of the EHLR, the Great Northern struck a deal to absorb the company in 1867. The EHLR would be, to all intents and purposes, part of the Great Northern Railway. The High Barnet branch opened in 1872. Totteridge was one of the stations on the line. It had also been on the Great Northern's rival scheme. It seems that in the planning stages it was to be named Totteridge Lane, but it was always the intention that it should serve both Totteridge and Whetstone. The planned line conveniently passed directly between the two villages. The station opened under the name Totteridge, although from 1874 it was named Totteridge and Whetstone. Well, probably. More on that later. The station back then didn't look so different from the present-day station. The most obvious difference was the goods yard, which was where the car park is now. The line had originally been built with agricultural traffic in mind, but not long after the line opened, the main kind of freight carried was building materials. The railway would turn the two villages into suburbs. Between 1870 and 1900, houses sprung up all over this once rural district. In 1889, a waiting room was added, and in 1896, a shelter for horse cabs. Further appeals for better facilities were dismissed by the Great Northern in 1899. But trouble was on the horizon. The fact was that the railway was not the most efficient of lines. It connected with the Great Northern Main Line at Finsbury Park, and the main line was a very busy line indeed. Remember how I said that the priority was getting to the big cities in the north? Well, the main line did just that, and under those circumstances you can imagine that a branch line didn't merit much priority. Furthermore, the steam locomotives struggled to get their crowded trains up the punishing gradients of the northern heights. Passengers complained about their situation. They argued that fares were too high, facilities were insufficient, and trains were slow and often delayed. The Great Northern's attitude was basically to ignore them and hope they went away. These seats were installed at Totteridge and Whetstone around the turn of the century, so commuters wouldn't get a good service, but at least they had somewhere to sit while they waited for the next overcrowded train. In 1906, a new railway came to Finsbury Park. The Great Northern, Piccadilly and Brompton Railway. This was an electrified tube line. It was fast, clean and frequent, and ran right through the middle of London. The Great Northern saw it as a threat and made sure that the Act of Parliament authorising it gave them the power of veto over any northern extension. "Oh, sure," said the Piccadilly Tube lads. "We won't run any trains beyond Finsbury Park." So from 1914 they started running buses instead. Trams were also operating from 1905. Passengers started flocking to these newer, cheaper forms of transport. In 1920, the N2s were introduced. These were powerful tank engines designed by Sir Nigel Gresley for suburban traffic on the Great Northern. But this wasn't ideal. By this time, electrification was becoming widespread on London's commuter lines, and the question was, when were the Great Northern Railway planning to do the same with their own branches? The answer was, never. In 1923, the Great Northern was amalgamated with a number of other companies to form the London and North Eastern Railway. But the LNER was, if anything, in an even worse position than the Great Northern. Punctuality on the High Barnet branch got worse. The LNER blamed it on poor quality coal, which, given how slow they had been about electrification, was rather adding insult to injury. Drastic action was needed, and it came in the form of the New Works programme, published in 1935. This was not the work of the LNER, but the recently formed London Passenger Transport Board. They proposed that since the LNER couldn't beat the Tube, they could join them, or more specifically, their branch lines in North London could. The so-called Northern Heights programme would connect the old EHLR lines with the Northern City Line, the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, and the City and South London Railway. Everything would be standardised, upgraded and electrified. Long story short, Totteridge was going to become a tube station. New trains were built to work the lines, the 1938 stock. This was a state-of-the-art train by late 30s standards, with underfloor motors and understated Art Deco styling throughout. So, state-of-the-art Deco, I guess. The first trains arrived in May 1939, not long before the outbreak of war. Now, as you might imagine, wartime slowed major infrastructure projects down. Soon, the railways would have their hands full just keeping things going. But electrification was moving fast enough that the line to High Barnet was considered worth continuing with. It helped that Mill Hill East was near to Ingalls Barracks, and Mill Hill East was just off the High Barnet branch. Electrification was completed in 1940. So while most of Britain was putting up with a poorly maintained railway where passenger trains had to give way to war traffic, commuters at Totteridge and Whetstone could enjoy an almost doubled service of brand new tube trains into town. The contrast with what had come before couldn't have been much greater. In 1941, the LNER passenger services ended, and Totteridge and Whetstone was officially an underground station. That being said, the LNER did continue to run goods trains here. And here, my friends, I run into a question. I've come across two sources that say that Totteridge and Whetstone was so called from 1874. So my question is, what's the deal with this sign? Was it a mistake? Was there a period when it was just called Totteridge? The people demand answers. By the people, I mean me, and by demand answers, I mean would quite like to know the answer if you have time, if it's not too much of a hassle. Actually, it's not that important. Don't worry about it. Wikipedia thinks it was opened as Whetstone and Totteridge, but I've found nothing to back that up. Again, if you know different, let me know in the comments. In 1948, the LNER became part of British Railways, who took over the goods service. Under BR, the traditional goods trains that had been a familiar part of the railways were run down in favour of bulk freight. What that meant for Totteridge and Whetstone was that the goods yard was closed in 1962. Today, Totteridge and Whetstone is a charming combination of old and new. There are plenty of historic features, which I hope I've given you a good look at. But it also enjoys a frequent service into London, which feels almost inappropriate for a station that looks like it should be on a sleepy country branch line. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this long-neglected tale from the Tube. If so, please do leave a like, and there's more on railways, London, and railways in London if you subscribe. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the Whetstone to my Totteridge. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.